Are you guys ready for some climate science on tap? Oh, that is so much better. I appreciate that enthusiasm and that energy because we will need that for tonight's event. This is Climate Science on Tap. Climate Science Goes to the Capitol, brought to you by Cascadia Climate Action. My name is Sean McDonald. I am a lecturer and research scientist in the program on the environment at the University of Washington. We've got a great panel for you this evening to talk about climate science, but this time, I want to expand your minds. Not natural science, not physical science. We are going to be talking about political science. Is your mind blown? My mind is blown. All right, we're going to talk about political science primarily. We have a great panel lined up for you this evening. We have Asim Prakash. Asim's in the audience, so you hear it for Asim. We've got Kyle Murphy from Carbon Washington. And we've got Jessen Farrell as well. So we've got a great lineup of folks tonight. The other thing I'm going to just say right off the bat is that we are about action with Cascadia Climate Action. And as such, we're expecting you to take some action tonight. First thing we want you to do is we want you to ask questions. There are little white 3x5 cards on your tables. Please use those to ask questions. So at any point during the presentations or as our speakers are talking, if you want to ask a question, please jot your questions down on those 3x5 cards. One of our volunteers will be circulating through the audience to grab those. So write a question down, wave it in the air, and our volunteers will come and retrieve it. Do you have a question? There's no cards back there. Oh my gosh. Look at Mary is springing into action right now to get you. Yes, exactly, dog. All right, so please, please, please ask questions. The other thing I want to mention right off the top of my head is that I want you to go to cascadiaclimateaction.org at some point and learn a little bit about all of the great stuff that Cascadia Climate Action is doing. It's a one-stop shop, a clearinghouse for information about climate change work that's being done in our area. And last but not least, I want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to visit a table before you leave. We got some great organizations tabling over here in this corner. They have all kinds of amazing things that you can do to help address the issue of climate change. So before you depart tonight, ask a question, take note of that web address, and stop by one of these tables over here to learn what you can do to help with the issue of climate change. I'm not going to speak any longer because I know you didn't come to hear me. I'm going to introduce our very first panelist, our first speaker for tonight. Our first speaker is Asim Prakash. He's a professor of political science, the Walker Family Professor for the College of the Arts and Sciences, and the founding director of the Center for Environmental Politics at the University of Washington. Professor Prakash is a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Board on Environmental Change in Society, and International Research Fellow at the Center for Corporate Reputation at the University of Oxford. Among his recent awards include International Studies Association's 2018 James N. Renault Award for Scholar who has made the most important contributions to globalization studies, and the European Consortium for Political Research Standing Group on Regulatory Governance's 2018 Regulatory Studies Development Award that recognizes a senior scholar who has made notable contributions to the field of regulatory governance. On top of all of that, he's helping the city of Edmonds. He serves on the Economic Development Commission for that city, the city that he calls home. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Asim Prakash to the stage.
Thanks, Sean. So I'm going to talk briefly on how social science, specifically political science, can influence climate discussions. And this is a deliberate tongue-in-cheek. Hi, Anne, how are you? Because oftentimes I hear at the university that we need to infuse policy with science. And that's really being said from the perspective of natural scientists and physical scientists. But social scientists have a slightly different take on public policy. And oftentimes, what we think is the appropriate way to go may not be shared by sciences with the different prefixes. So I'm going to offer a political science perspective on the carbon tax, and specifically I'm going to highlight the problems of carbon tax and why carbon tax failed in the state of Washington and has been opposed in some other parts of the world. So just to step back, what exactly impedes climate action? Now, we've had tons of IPCC reports. We have this assessment and that assessment. Every 2 weeks, there is an expert committee talking about how the world is going to burn in a few years, if not a few decades. And yet, the policy traction is not there. In fact, in 2018, carbon emissions have actually increased. And coal consumption is increasing. So obviously, there is a problem. So there are 4 basic, from a social science perspective, problems in climate action. First is what we call the global commons problem. Is that okay? Global commons problem means protecting the climate or protecting the atmosphere, its ability to absorb carbon dioxide is a global public good that benefits all, whose benefits cannot be excluded, are not excludable, whereas the costs of doing so tend to be, not always, but predominantly so, local. So this is what we call a classic free rider problem. The second is there is a perceived asymmetry between benefits and costs. People who pick up the cost of protecting the atmosphere, of mitigating climate change, may not be the ones who are directly benefiting from it. So whenever there is a cost-benefit asymmetry, it leads to political problems, predominantly because people who bear the costs, the coal miners, the teamsters, the blue-collar workers, have an incentive to organize and protest or derail that policy. The third is what I call SUV hypocrisy. I'd initially said Subaru hypocrisy. As many of you who drive Subaru may not know, Subaru is technically a truck. They cheated in early 2000 by reclassifying Subaru as truck so that they could emit. They did regular fudging, not the VDUF fudging, they did regulatory fudging out in the open. But I call it SUV hypocrisy because I'm a polite person. I don't want to upset my audience. And essentially the argument is that I am virtuous, but it's these people who are bad. And you can choose these, it could be oil industry, it could be coal, it could be X, Y, or Z. But we don't question our virtuosity. We are, immaculately conceived, and we are really, really very nice. So we are not the source of problem, we are just the solution. And fourth is what we call agency perceptions. I hear this all the time from lots of people that Aseem, I agree with you, something has to be done. But can the action of one person make a difference? And the problem is, one person doesn't make a difference. But if all of us think one person doesn't make a difference, then nothing will happen. It's a classic collective action problem. So we face what we call structural problems in global climate action. Of course, in response to these problems, we have a host of policy instruments. And I'll not go through the list of these, but it could be voluntary, not so voluntary, coercive, it could be direct quantitative quotas, it could be price signals, it could be carbon registers, it could be legal, etc., etc. All of you know that. I don't have to invest time in this, so I'll just go to the carbon tax. So carbon tax, in theory, is a very, very clean and elegant instrument. And the argument is something as follows, that the market mechanism does not account for or cost for what we call an externality. Externality means the costs are being externalized somebody else. Consequently, the firm that's following the cost curve overproduces the externality. So if you can create a system where people who are doing bad things, people who are externalizing costs, are made to internalize it, market failure will be corrected. It's sometimes called the Pigouvian tax. Sir Arthur Cecil Pigou, who was a great economist of 1930s, had talked about this, how a tax intervention can correct an externality problem. And the argument is because externality has been internalized, the price will increase. If price increases, demand will fall, and the behavior will align with the market logic without heavy-handed and visible state intervention. In theory, beautiful. It works so well. But there are problems, or there are challenges. So the first is, how high should price signal be for people to take notice? So think of 732 or 1631. The price hike would have been about 15 cents a gallon. But the average fluctuation in the price of gasoline on an yearly basis is almost 80 cents to $1. So most people, when they are told you have to pay 15 cents extra, would they even notice? And if they don't even notice, why would they change their behaviors? So we have to be sure that when we argue for a price signal, the price signal is strong enough for people to take note of it. Otherwise, it's a wash. Number two, assume we can jack up the price. We can make driving very expensive. But do people really have a choice? Can people junk their cars and say, I'm going to start biking to work? Or I can start taking public transportation to work? No. So if you are giving a price signal, make sure there are alternatives, arguably at the same price range that's available to people. Otherwise, people will protest. Otherwise, people will revolt. Because then a tax is not changing the relative prices, it's a revenue extraction. The third is, and that is the state of Washington story, how should tax money be used? So 732 said, give the money back to people. 1631 said, no, don't give money back to people, let's spend it. And both sides have a logic. A revenue neutral carbon tax and a revenue positive carbon tax both have compelling logics, but this is where politics comes in. Politics is really not about how much money is being used, but how the money is going to be spent. Who gets the goodies? How is the pie going to be divided? That's the traditional definition of politics. Who gets what and how? Farrell had said about 50 years ago. Then the concern is there is a disproportionate burden on poor, because the poor people spend a higher proportion of their income on energy. If you raise cost of energy, poor get hurt. And a lot of people who advocate for carbon tax recognize this problem. And there are always certain mechanisms put in place to help poor. But in the perception of poor people, in the perception of underprivileged, they are still picking up much of the tab. In fact, we are doing an analysis of advertising strategy of 1631, and the predominant focus of the no side in their TV advertisements has been on cost. That's very important. And then, of course, it's the issue of carbon leakages through trade. That, okay, state of Washington becomes virtuous, we jack up the price of carbon. But what if companies relocate elsewhere? And this is not a new debate, it's a pretty old debate. The debate started in 1980s when there was a fear that polluting industries are leaving the United States abroad. It was called the pollution haven hypothesis. And because you can export back the products, there is no incentive to actually change the status quo. I'm working on a paper where we demonstrate that the reduction in carbon emissions since 1990 can take place either through switch to renewables or through carbon leakages, trade leakages. Trade leakages are 4 times as strong as renewable energy. So this is what we call carbon fudging, that you essentially export the dirty industries abroad. So why so much of pushback against carbon tax? So let me start with the example of France, lovely France. 2015 is the Paris Agreement, right? And it's celebrated as a very important milestone in global environmental politics because China and India, for the first time, are willing to talk about mandates. Even if they are voluntary, they are willing to talk about targets. Huge achievement. And in 2017, when President Trump announced that the United States will withdraw from Paris, President Macron goes on television and makes the statement.
Today, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced his decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement. I do respect this decision, but I do think it is an actual mistake, both for the US and for our planet. To all scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, responsible citizens who were disappointed by the decision of the President of the United States, I want to say that they will find in France a second homeland. I call on them, come and work here with us. I reaffirm clearly that the Paris Agreement remains irreversible and will be implemented, not just by France, but by all the other nations. We will succeed because we are fully committed. Because wherever we live, whoever we are, we all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again. Thank you.
So lovely words by the President of France. Really amazing, right? Then you fast forward 2019. Is France still the climate leader? The answer is, well, we don't know. The Conference of Party meeting was taking place in Poland, and France erupted in a protest called the Yellow Vest protests. Yellow Vest means people, the drivers in France by law are asked to carry a yellow vest in case they have to stop the car and have to attend to an accident. So it's rural France and working class France were protesting against a fuel price hike, what President Macron called a climate levy. And they were really very angry, and it got very violent. And I'm sure all of you have watched the footage of the Yellow Vest protests. It's continuing even today. And they are thinking of calling in the military, the army, to quell the protests. Of course, President Macron rushed back to France. He canceled the fuel price hike. And then he engaged in a 3-month-long, what we call an apology tour, going to various communities and talking. And essentially the argument was the rural residents of France, the working class in France said, we don't have a choice. We have to drive our cars. We don't have public transportation. So any price hike in fuel is balancing the climate books on our back. It was a popular protest. It is anti-climate populism. And this is happening in France, where the same gentleman 2 years ago was saying, come to France, we are the climate leaders. Let's talk about state of Washington. I think everybody in this room has an opinion about that. 1631, I'll not talk about 732, but we can talk about 732 during Q&As. If you look at the numbers, we are doing a series of papers, crunching data, precinct level, that what exactly happened in 1631. So there are a couple of things I'd like to highlight. One, it got about 43.5% vote, which is about 3 percentage point more than 732. Number two, Senator Cantwell, who's running the same election, got about 58.4% vote. So in a sense, every fourth Cantwell voter did not support 1631. Every fourth Cantwell voter did not support 1631. So what we did was, on the y-axis, we have percentage of Cantwell supporters or Cantwell voters, and on the x-axis, I have percentage of 1631 support. The 45-degree line means in a particular county, both Cantwell and 1631 scored 50%, but most of the counties are above the 45-degree line. And if you notice, it's almost like a straight line. That means there's a steady erosion of Cantwell support across county. It's not an Eastern Washington, Western Washington divide. It's across county. And this is something all of us need to step back and say, what happened? Why could not the liberal vote bank that supported Senator Cantwell got converted into a 1631 affirmation vote? This is an issue we need to talk about. So why this opposition? So one is that world over, there is what we call populism. It's both left-wing populism, Bernie Sanders style, or right-wing populism. There's populism. There's a suspicion of elite institutions. And there's a feeling, right or wrong, in some sections of society, that climate policy has become an elite policy. It's a preoccupation of the elite. And climate books are being balanced on the back of poor and underprivileged. Nevis Dolchak and I, in one of our articles, we said in America, the fight is really between the sushi world and the steak world. So you have the coastal elites, including Seattle, where we are very progressive, thankfully. We are very pro-climate, thankfully. But our values and our perceptions are not shared by the Midwest, what we call the flyover country. And there is a big conflict. It's not only a cultural conflict, it's an economic conflict. And there's a perception of elitism. I was talking with some labor leaders from Colorado earlier last week, and I was surprised to see the opposition to the Green New Deal. Only 6 of the top 50 environmental NGOs have endorsed the Green New Deal. We are actually doing a small paper on that, gauging the depth of support for the Green New Deal. So the bottom line is, rightly or wrongly, there is a perception in certain sections of society that climate politics, carbon tax, these are elite preoccupations. And the elites are really not concerned about the common people. And there is this broader problems. One is climate change will not affect me. When other policy concerns are put in the mix, climate policies really takes a nosedive. Carbon tax is unfair, equity issues, and it won't work. Let me briefly talk about that. If you look at this map, percentage of adults who think global warming will harm them personally, if it's red, that means 100%. If you go down the scale, it's 0. And what you would see is, except for a few areas, you barely find even yellows, even in places like Florida, which one would expect would be abuzz with pro-climate activism because people see the hurricanes day in and day out. There is a perception that climate change will not personally affect me. When climate policies put in with other policies, climate policies or climate concerns take a nosedive. These are 2018 exit polls. When people are asked what motivated their vote, it's healthcare, immigration, economy, and gun policy. Climate policy does not feature amongst the top issues on which people vote. You look at the Pew poll 2019 on the eve of the State of the Union, and people are asked what should public policy priorities would be. Climate change is at the rock bottom. So the reality is, when you put climate with other policy issues, climate policies are not getting the priority they ought to get, the priority they deserve. So what's the way forward? Let me quickly outline a few ideas. First is, as I said, climate policy will impose costs on specific actors, specific sectors. If we really want a winning coalition, we have to take into account the interest of these actors. Coal miners are not enemies. Coal miners are just working hard to put food on their table. And by declaring a war on coal, we have declared a war on coal miners. The same thing is holding for fossil fuel industry. The same thing is holding for blue-collar workers. So if we really want climate policy that draws the broad coalition, that reconstruct the FDR coalition, then we'll have to talk about embedded environmentalism. We'll have to embed environmentalism in the new social compact. And I think the Green New Deal makes a good first step at this. Plus, all of us, anybody who's pro-environment, don't waste your time in Seattle, New York, and San Francisco. Go to West Virginia. Go to coal country. Go to depressed areas that are ravaged by opioid crisis and try to tell people there why they need to support climate change and how climate change is going to improve their quality of life. Here we are just preaching to the choir, and I don't think it's politically very helpful. That is the litmus test, West Virginia, Midwest, and that's what we ought to be doing. This is the statement Richard Trumka, the former chief of AFL-CIO, made in San Francisco, and it's a very powerful statement. We are actually trying to get him to come to University of Washington and talk about this. Second is, climate change is hobbled by very, very poor and dishonest elites. That's our good friend, Mr. Caprio, who flew in a private jet from France to New York to receive an environmental prize and then flew back, of course. My tribe, academics, we are hypocrites, number 2. Nevis and I have been trying to talk with people that we are, as academics, having the knowledge about climate change, and we have a moral responsibility to reduce our carbon footprint. So we published this piece in Huffington Post, The Climate Change Hypocrisy of Jet-Setting Academics, where we asked that all academics must have a carbon budget. We must demonstrate to ourselves and to our stakeholders that we are leading by example. If we ask coal miners to give up their jobs, academics should be the first one to do so. Because climate message cannot be separated from the messenger. Mahatma Gandhi could not have preached simplicity by wearing an Armani suit and zipping around in an Audi. He had to have a simple lifestyle to demonstrate that he can walk the simplicity talk. And as academics, we need to walk the climate talk. I think there is an IPCC fatigue. My apologies to my scientist friends. I think we have too much of information on climate change. I don't read the yet another IPCC report. I don't. The whole idea about these scientific reports is what we call the information deficit model. That people are ignorant, you give them information and whoa, people will change their perceptions. That doesn't happen. People are prisoners of what we call motivated reasoning. Both the left and the right are caught in their own bubbles and their own echo chambers. People seek information to validate their prior beliefs. Information deficit model is not changing people who are the swing voters. If you want to change swing voters, talk politics. Tell people how climate is going to help them. Don't tell them the earth will burn in 10 years or 12 years or 25 years. That's irrelevant. Tell them how it's going to help them. Give them concrete ideas and give them a change that they can relate to. That's why I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is really a thought leader, because she is giving a pathway to the future, not harping on negative partisanship, but giving a positive vision. And that's what we need to give. Give a positive vision. And do climate change, but don't call it climate change. My favorite example is gasoline taxes. Red states have increased gasoline taxes. Ohio, Oklahoma. And what do they say? They don't call it climate change. They say we are going to rebuild our infrastructure. Excellent. So do your carbon tax, call it a road tax, and earmark the money for a concrete benefit that people can relate to. Not about saving the world, but saving your roads. Improving your quality of life. So you can do climate change without getting hung up on the phrase climate change and framing in a slightly different way. So to conclude, citizens don't view climate change as a pressing issue. We have to increase the issue salience. And we have to do it in the innovative way. More IPCC reports are not going to do the trick. We've had too many of them already. Taxes are a taboo word. Try not to use the word tax. Even if you call it a carbon fee, people see through the fudging. We have to get a bit more innovative on that. And there's a perception that climate policy is being balanced on the back of poor people. We have to change that perception. And this is a very important problem, at least in my opinion, we face. And finally, we have to rethink climate communication, talk in terms of benefits, local benefits, not in terms of costs, and not try to scare people, because scaring only makes people a bit more defensive about their preferences. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jessen. That was a lot of really great stuff to think about. As a scientist, I'm going to try not to take it personally, that you literally just called us all out there. But this is good. This is going to be great for our conversation later. I'm going to go ahead and move it right along, and we're going to have our next panelist up. Kyle Murphy is a graduate of the University of Washington, where he completed a political science degree with honors. He has worked on climate change and sustainability for 10 years now. He launched local divestment efforts, worked for the Sierra Club, and worked on transit campaigns in Seattle. In 2015, he helped to found the I-732 Carbon Tax Initiative campaign and served as its co-director. He has since served as Carbon Washington's executive director, where he brings together Carbon Washington's policy, elections, and communications work. And as a side note, he was actually a minor in our program, the program on the environment, so that's pretty cool. I'm excited about that. Go POE. Outside of work, Kyle is an avid cyclist and also a law school student. So let's give it up for Kyle Murphy.
Go ahead, yeah. Okay, now that Asim has sufficiently depressed you all, I'm ready to tell you about how we're really going to do something good this year. Kyle Murphy with Carbon Washington. Carbon Washington is about building the political will for climate action, electing better legislators, developing better policies, running better initiatives. So if you want to be in the fight, be sure before you leave today, stop by and visit Katsi at our table. Visit the other great tables here too, Audubon, 350, Cascadia Climate Action. So when we think about climate change, it's a global issue, and one of the comments we regularly hear is that what should Washington do? Like, we have hydropower. Can you hear me in the back, by the way? Good? Okay. Up a little bit, okay. What should Washington do? We have hydropower. We drive Subarus. Apparently Subarus are trucks. But, we're pretty green here, and this is a global issue, so maybe we should just rest on our laurels. But for a few reasons, it's really important that right here, we lead the way. One is that nothing is going to happen in D.C. for at least another year and a half. Another reason is that since the United States has left the Paris Agreement, other countries are looking to the states to try to figure out whether America is committed to addressing this issue. So at least if the federal government is going in one way, if a state's going in another way, that's a powerful signal to the whole world. And the last reason is that by addressing climate change, doing it successfully, we can be a model for a time when the federal government is actually interested in addressing this problem. So right now, our state legislature is in session until the end of April. They're considering a number of really important climate bills of different varieties. I'll tell you about them briefly. The two on the top, the 100% clean electricity bill and the clean fuel standards, are good examples of a regulatory approach. Instead of using a carbon tax like Seem was describing, you can just go to a certain sector of the economy and just order them to do something. Order them to shut down coal plants, order them to blend in biofuels. So the top one would create a pathway by which Washington State would eventually get all of our electricity from carbon-free sources, hydro, wind, solar, batteries, renewable natural gas, and other things. The low-carbon fuel standard would require oil companies to blend in biofuels, not palm oil, but local low-carbon biofuels, and to adopt other measures to reduce the carbon intensity of gasoline. There is a carbon tax-like bill. That's the cap and trade one that is just introduced in the Senate and working its way through at the very beginning stages. This would create a market mechanism by which you trade permits that you have to pay for to pollute. And then another type of bill that Carbon Washington has been working on is more of an educational bill around biochar. Biochar is a really amazing byproduct that you can develop from forestry and agriculture, where you actually run your leftover organic material through a biochar processor, and you can sequester carbon and bury it in the ground, and then actually improve soil health as well. So we've been educating lawmakers on this important technology. And the last type of climate policy is a grant or a subsidy program, where instead of, again, using a carbon tax, or instead of ordering a sector to do something, you can pay them to do something that you want them to do. So Carbon Washington, we spearheaded a bill called the Sustainable Farm Bill that would pay farmers to adopt low carbon practices like cover cropping, biochar, smart pesticide applicators. That bill passed through one chamber. It looks like it's stalled for this year, but the other ones above it are still alive. So they're interesting examples of what climate policy looks like in action. And I think they also illustrate a challenge facing the movement, because our problem and our solutions are not necessarily exactly the same thing, in the way that marriage equality or gun control has a very simple message. If you have a gun, problem, you just address it with gun access. If you have a civil rights problem, you grant rights to those people. We are trying to reorganize our whole economy. And so I would just add that to the long list of challenges, is figuring out compelling ways to communicate what we're doing, why it's important, and how it connects back to climate change in a compelling way. So with that, I will pass it over to our next panelist.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle, for giving us that overview. I really appreciate it. So we're just going to move right along to our next panelist. She's going to give us some brief comments as well. Our next panelist is Jessen Farrell. Jessen grew up in Lake City neighborhood and the adjacent city of Lake Forest Park. At Shorecrest High School, she was voted most likely to be a politician, which is great because then she did become a politician. She represented Washington's 46th legislative district in the state House of Representatives from 2013 to 2017, when she resigned to run for mayor of Seattle. In the legislature, she focused on transportation, education, and labor issues. Jessen graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in history and holds a JD from Boston College Law School. She's going to tell us a little bit about the inside works of the House of Washington State Legislature. So without further ado, let's welcome Jessen.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. So my job today is to talk a little bit about the legislature and climate science. And I am not going to talk about how a bill becomes a law. So I'm not going to talk about committee schedules and co-sponsors and bill numbers and that kind of thing. Instead, I'm going to talk about the elements that I really think are necessary to get big social change as it goes through the legislative process. And so one of the things that is and so to start, I am actually going to quote Andrew Breitbart. Now I imagine many of us are very concerned about what he hath wrought. But there is something that he said that I think is really important, and that is that politics follows culture. And if you want to do big things politically, you have to focus on changing culture. And I would actually amend that slightly, and I would say that not only do you need to change culture, but before that, you need to change narrative. And in this case, I don't mean, messaging or talking points. I mean those deeply held stories that we tell ourselves about how the world works. And if you are able to change the stories that we tell ourselves, you are able to do big things. So I am going to walk us through a few of those stories that you will find very familiar, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about climate politics and what we need to do to really, I think, move the ball forward. Okay, so the first story that many of you may be very familiar with is this idea that raising wages kills jobs. How many of you have heard that before? Raising wages kills jobs. Okay, so if you're a policymaker and you believe that raising wages kills jobs, you are going to be just fine with wage suppression. On the other hand, if you are a policymaker and you believe that prosperity comes from the middle class and from lower wage earners being able to have money to spend in their communities, you are going to be much more comfortable with a national $15 an hour minimum wage, or paid family leave, or paid sick leave, or any of those other economic policies that make people thrive. Okay, here's another example from my former world. I used to be the executive director of Transportation Choices Coalition many years back. One of the fights, though, that we had was this idea that transportation is about moving cars. So if you believe as a policymaker that transportation is about moving cars, you are going to be just fine with allocating roadway space for parking. You're going to feel great about building more highways. On the other hand, if you believe that transportation is fundamentally about moving people, you are going to invest in all of the different ways we get around, whether it's walking or biking or transit, and yes, indeed, for some of us, cars. But without that shift of narrative and story that you tell yourself, you're not going to be able to get to that policy shift. So one more example. For a long time, and until really quite recently, many people in our community and our country believed that marriage was between a man and a woman. And if you believed that, you were going to be okay with voting by initiative a state constitutional amendment that would require marriage to be just for a man and a woman. On the other hand, if you believed that marriage is for two adults who love each other, you are going to feel obligated to extend civil rights to every single member in our community. And to get to that narrative shift, a lot of work had to be done culturally and politically to get to a place where, you know, the Supreme Court was declaring that marriage equality was the law of the land. And we need to do the same thing when we're talking about science in policymaking. Because here is what I have seen happen over and over and over again. When science is in conflict with the stories that we tell ourselves, science loses. But when science complements the stories that we tell ourselves, it supercharges policymaking. And so I'm going to give one more example of something not in the climate world, and then I promise I will talk about climate for a moment. So I passed a law with my Republican counterpart, Ann Rivers, to prohibit driving while holding your cell phone. How many people love that law? So many people don't love that law, but many people do. So one of the things that happened with that is that there's a fundamental story that we all believe. It is cultural consensus. If you are on the highway, it should be safe. And we've put in place all kinds of policy supports to make that true. We have a traffic safety commission that investigates every single highway death. The State Patrol is going to pull you over. We have we have drunk driving laws. We have design guidelines for our highways. We have this whole policy infrastructure to support that fundamental belief that our highways should be safe. And so in 2013, when we saw an uptick in traffic fatalities, the Traffic Safety Commission worked with researchers to see why that was happening. And what they found was that, well, distracted driving use has gone up. And so as I was thinking about my remarks in the car today on the highway, I literally saw a guy eating a corn dog with a stick that was very pointy. And you might ask yourself, well, why didn't we just ban all distracting things? You know, somebody could get in a car crash eating a corn dog on a stick. And that argument actually came up in the legislature. But because we had great scientists who were able to come work with us, they were able to say, well, the kind of distraction that your brain engages in when you're literally looking at your phone is a very different kind of distraction than when you're eating a corn dog on a pointy stick. And so we were able to keep the conversation focused on distracted driving as it relates to cell phones. Okay, so how does this relate to the climate change fight and science? Because it is so deeply frustrating. The scientific consensus has been, so complete for so long, and yet policymakers are really not doing what we need to do to be able to turn this around. So one of the things I've been thinking about is that particularly we brought up the carbon tax and the politics on the carbon tax. Well, one of the problems is that both with 732 and 1631, right, is that those tax conversations were not able to get to that fundamentally deeply held belief, which is that environmental regulation raises costs. It'll raise your costs. And so when a voter is faced with that deeply held story and an oil industry pouring tens of millions of dollars into a campaign against a carbon tax, it is nearly impossible to defeat it, even when you have the biggest, broadest, best, most animated grassroots coalition out there, which has been the case in, I really think, both of these carbon initiatives. Now, there are some places in the climate fight where we've done a really good job of that narrative flip, and one of those is the Power Past Coal campaign. How many of you are familiar with the Power Past Coal campaign? So one of the things that's happened over time is it was a long time believed that coal is efficient. Coal is the most efficient, wonderful way to power our economy. And over time, we've changed that belief to see that coal is dirty. And the Power Past Coal campaign took it one more step, which is to say, there's a way of powering our economy past coal. And that was a compelling enough campaign where in Washington state, we have not permitted, we have not approved, and we have not funded any new fossil fuel infrastructure in the last several years. And that's a really huge victory, and in part because of a savvy campaign that had a really great narrative attached to it. And so finally, I'll just talk a little bit about the Green New Deal and how I think the role of science and narrative and grassroots organizing is really what it's going to take to do that. So the first thing about the Green New Deal is that it sets the fight on our terms. So rather than allowing the other side to say environmental regulation is going to kill jobs and raise your costs, this goes directly at it and says the Green New Deal is about prosperity. It is about creating jobs. And so that is really important because it takes the fight and it puts it on our terms instead of theirs. So that's number one. The second thing is that once you're in that narrative space, which is how are we going to create jobs with a clean, green, just economy, then you get to work with the scientific community and say, well, what is the best place to go first? Given the crisis, where should we be focusing first? And when you're able to combine science and narrative like that, suddenly a lot of possibility opens up. And then finally, when you combine it with the grassroots power that is we are seeing in the Green New Deal movement, in the Sunrise movement, and in all of the energy in this room, that's when I think we're really able to get big political change. So thank you so much, and I think we're going to shift into questions.
Thank you so much, Jessen. If I could get all of our presenters to come up front, all of our panelists, and you can have a seat, and you all get your own microphones. So, folks, remember at the very beginning of tonight's festivities, I mentioned that we have 3x5 cards out of the tables. This is your opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. If you have filled out a 3x5 card, if you just hold it up and wave it around, one of our volunteers can come by and grab it. You might have to wave it pretty high in the air so that she can see it. We're going to go ahead and sort through those questions and make sure that you get a chance to get your question answered. But in the meantime, I'd like to go ahead and start off with our panelists. I really enjoyed hearing you all, and you all had some different interesting messages, which I think are fun to explore. One of the things, because this is Climate Science on Tap, and we talk a lot about climate science, it was interesting hearing from Hasim. I'm just wondering, from your standpoint, Jessen, as someone who spent time in the legislature, where do you mentioned the corn dog on a stick, which, by the way, I'm very happy you didn't outlaw corn dogs because they are my favorite food. But where as a legislator, were you getting your scientific information primarily? And especially when it comes to issues like climate change, where were you primarily getting information on those topics?
So in the legislature, we do have opportunities to get briefed by scientists through the committee process, and that is hugely helpful because it's an opportunity to have presentations for legislators to ask questions. But one of the major obstacles, particularly with climate science in the legislature, is that it's really limited to only a couple of committees, the Transportation Committee and the Environment Committee. And we know that the climate issue cuts across so many different parts of our lives. It would be really interesting to have a climate hearing in the Health Committee or climate hearing in the Labor Committee, because we know that there are impacts on people's health and on people and on the economy. So that's one thing. The second thing is that one of the chief tactics of special interests is to muddy the science. A lot of legislators are not scientists, and so to have well-paid lobbyists who are there 24/7 presenting kind of a cloud as to what the scientific consensus is can really get in the way of good policy making. And I guess that's why I would say a really great pitch for this crowd is that's why we need scientists in the legislature. So consider running yourself.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. So Hasim, I think that's an interesting thing to hear Jessen say. You mentioned this idea that we don't really need more science necessarily, but do you think it's just that do we need to communicate that science more clearly, or do you think we just shift away from talking about the science of climate change and think more about what climate adaptation gets us in terms of benefits?
So when I'm saying we don't need science, I'm trying to provoke. So
You're provoking me.
Of course, we need more science and we need better knowledge. And the more sophisticated tools we have, the better it is. But I think the broader point I'm trying to make is that if you sit back or reflecting on the wonderful remarks of Jesse, The dominant model is what I call an information deficit model. That we don't get the right policy because we don't have information. If we provide information from credible and authoritative sources, people will change their perceptions. In some cases, that might be true. But in other cases, that may not be true. Think of nuclear energy. You must have seen those buses going around Seattle where they're saying what? 1/4 of nuclear weapons are within 20 miles of Puget Sound or something of that kind, right? Or see the knee-jerk reaction against nuclear reactors. How many people died in 3 Mile Island, which has just celebrated its 40th anniversary? Zilch. Maybe, there were second-order effects, radiation exposure. More people die from coal dust. There are much more severe health damages from coal dust. But when it comes to having a nuclear power plant in your vicinity, suddenly it's the NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard. Because people have certain kinds of knee-jerk reactions. They have certain kinds of perceptions. No matter how much scientific information you give them, they will not change their perceptions. So I think the point Jesse made was a brilliant one. We need to change the narrative. Because people are responding to certain scripts. And we have to figure out what are these scripts. And I love the example she said, to date, the script is regulations kill jobs. If we can create a script that environmental policy creates jobs, then we start getting a virtuous cycle where people say, you know what? A support for solar is a support for job. A support for wind is a support for job. Some of the most arduous and articulate proponents of wind energy are actually Republican governors. Midwestern Republican governors, starting from Iowa, Ohio, all the way down to Texas, which is not quite Midwest, love wind energy. Why? Because wind energy creates jobs. Wind energy creates rural jobs. The farmer can have a ready source of income which is counter-cyclical because agricultural industry tends to be cyclical. So wind energy is a win-win situation. That's the narrative. Wind energy is jobs. So I think this is the narrative that we need to have. Of course it will be informed by science. I'm a scientist myself. We need good knowledge. And we want the narrative to be informed by the right science, not by the wrong science. But stopping at science and thinking that science will do the heavy lifting is a tactic we have been trying for the last 20 years and not succeeded, at least to the extent we'll want. So we need to change the narrative.
All right, I like that. So actually, then Kyle, just pivoting to you, in terms of the bills that Carbon Washington is supporting right now, how many do you think really focus on this idea of flipping the script, so to speak, and thinking about creating jobs and thinking about the things that we can do through regulation and the like to create opportunities?
One topic that we have that both Asim and Jessen have been talking about but haven't put exactly this way is solution aversion. I think one challenge we have, particularly with conservative folks, is if they hate the solution, you're going to be much more likely to deny the problem. I think we could all examine our own lives and find instances like that. So on the farm bill I was talking about, we were talking about paying farmers who are suffering from a trade war right now to do cover cropping, to put money directly in farmers' pockets in the rural economy to sequester carbon. And that was resonating with Democrats, but it was equally co-sponsored by Republicans, and it had Republican votes all the way, and it's not going to get over the line this year. I think it might get there next year. But I think there's another side to that, too, where all of a sudden you're going to think about a problem a little bit more if the solution involves your folks getting paid, and it's not just about, the other parties or the other side's folks benefiting. That's something we hear that's, one way to try to create a little bit of a bridge. I think the other bills have, good names, 100% clean electricity. How could you be against that? And I think they really are benefiting from that kind of front level branding. And one of the challenges we've had as carbon tax proponents is that it's empirically, if you can only do one thing, that's the thing to do. It's the best single thing we could do, but it's not the only thing we could do. But it's almost like leading with the medicine. It's the tool that gets us to the outcome, but we need to sell people on the outcome. So I think by working on some single sector bills, we're able to have a little bit of an easier conversation, and I think we will get there on carbon tax, but we have to build that story of the outcome and then tell people how this gets them there.
All right, thank you. Actually, here's an interesting question from the audience. There's a question about natural fracked gas or natural gas in general. I think for a long time we've been talking about natural gas as a clean alternative to other things. In fact, politicians have pushed that as sort of a bridge in some respects, in some cases. And maybe that narrative that natural gas is somehow cleaner than other fossil fuels is going to bite us at some point, because we have to switch that narrative as well. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts on how we might shift that narrative.
Well, I think one way to talk about energy, and particularly fracking, and that's a really great example of an energy source being literally marketed as clean, as the clean alternative. And of course, we know how problematic it is from a number of different ways. And a lot of people get natural gas in their kitchens. I mean, one thing that I would hope that maybe some of the researchers in the room might be able to do is help us understand the health effects of having this in our homes. That's always a really great place to start. You know, how does this thing affect me? Particularly in Washington State, where, you know, we use hydro. So that might be one way to start to talk about this. How is this a personal health issue? How is this in our homes and something that is toxic for our kids, toxic for folks who are vulnerable? And it would be really helpful to learn more about that. And maybe there's a lot of research out there that I need to learn about. But that might be the place I might start to figure out how to reframe that.
One tactic in the environmental community we are trying to adopt is to stop calling it natural gas. That makes it sound really like, oh, nice, and the logos have little green leaves from the companies. It's very clever, and it's not. It's fracked gas, just like oil and coal. They dig it up. It makes people sick along the way. It damages the atmosphere when they burn it. So I think choose your language intentionally. But I think it's important not to be too dogmatic. There are a handful of very narrow applications where we may need natural gas, like for international shipping, where it could actually be an improvement. So that's just kind of, I think, let's change the narrative, but also be mindful of not then becoming dogmatic.
All right. Asim, going back to you, question from the audience about racial equity and social justice, and how we embed those topics into our conversations about climate change and dealing with climate-related issues.
Yeah, this is a very important issue. I think climate change is the new civil rights issue of our times. There is research after research that shows disproportionate impact of fossil fuel emissions on people who are underprivileged, by color, by race, by class. We had a wonderful presentation by Rachel Morello-Forsch at Center for Environmental Politics a month ago, and she looked at California cap and trade, and what she did is she looked at the thermal power plant, a coal-fired plant, and put a radius of 10 miles, another radius of 50 miles. People living within a distance of 10 miles of the thermal power plant were having a preterm birth of something like 7%. And the moment you move to 50, the preterm birth rate fell to 5%. There's a 28% drop just by moving from 10-mile radius to 30 or 20-mile radius. And there is research after research that shows that people of color and poor people are being disproportionately affected. So there is no doubt in my mind that this is an important issue of equity. And it's affecting poor people, it's affecting children, and the long-term and the short-term costs are disproportionate. I come from the city of Delhi. In Delhi, every fourth child has a respiratory problem because of the pollution. But what is interesting is, because air pollution is visible, because air pollution has demonstrable costs, because air pollution affects children, it also asks for, or it creates the ground for popular mobilization. This is called the co-benefits argument. That don't sell climate change as climate change. Sell it as reducing pollution in your neighborhood. So you see China becoming suddenly very gung-ho about reducing pollution, becoming climate leader. Of course, there are several factors, but one of the important factors is the high pollution level in Chinese city and the legitimacy the Chinese government needs by making sure the pollution level comes down. It's the co-benefits argument. Same with India. One of the reasons India is jumping on the climate bandwagon, in spite of a lot of problems, is because Indian cities are amongst the most polluted cities in the world. And there's a huge backlash from the politically powerful middle class. So it comes back to the point I was trying to make. Think about climate change not in terms of costs, think in terms of benefits. It could be jobs or it could be health benefits. And give stories about children, give stories about people who are vulnerable, and then show how doing good for the environment, how reducing pollution, weaning yourself off coal, off diesel, is actually going to create short-term, local, and demonstrable benefits.
All right, thank you very much for that. So actually, kind of spinning off of that, Kyle, is Carbon Washington reaching out to some of these vulnerable communities, the communities that are most likely to be affected, and trying to engage them in these conversations in some way, trying to get them to take action in some way?
Well, we work throughout the state, and that includes the Duwamish Valley, and that includes Spokane, and that includes Yakima. And so one organization can't do everything. So sometimes we aren't on the ground in a place where we want to be, so we find a partner organization to work with. So we've endorsed the HEAL Act, which was on the slide and I didn't talk about, which is an act brought forward by social justice organizations and environmental justice organizations. And we're supporting this bill to incorporate environmental justice principles into all state agency work. So when the state agency is making a decision about something, they're going to have to do a quick stop. What is the impact, the environmental impact on underrepresented communities? And so, one way to I think reach out is to just play a supporting role and say, we're here, we're on this bill, and we need to see it get done for the reasons we've all just been talking about.
Okay, great. Someone brought to my attention a little bit earlier that right now down in Olympia there's looks like there's discussion on ES House Bill 1109, which is an effort I think right now to reduce the amount of funding for climate science education K-12. I'm wondering if anybody knows about that or how we might be able to take some action in that regard.
Well, I don't remember the numbers, but there is a bill right now that's bipartisan that I think's got a good chance of passing that would increase and enhance and support climate education. So we'll have to look into this because that sounds bad, but there's a bill going in the exact opposite direction that we've endorsed and we've been providing some support for.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. I'm realizing, y'all, because of our time, we've gone over our time already, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So at this point, I'd like y'all just to give a round of applause to our panelists. And I'll have you know that we do take a look at all of these cards, and we'll get our panelists to answer these questions, and we'll send out an email blast to all of our audience later on. But I do want to allow time tonight for you all to have a chance to speak with our panelists, and so I want to just close with a couple of things, and then at that point, if you want to ask your questions directly of these guys, I want you to use that opportunity to do so. But I do want to mention just a couple of things real quick about the organizations that we have with us tonight. Because in addition to getting your questions answered, I'm hoping that you all have an opportunity to speak with the fine folks who are tabling over here to my left. So the first group I want to highlight is 350 Seattle. 350 Seattle is this, there we go, right over there in the corner. Statewide civic action team engaged in citizen outreach to elected officials at all levels of government, advocating for bold climate legislation and principles of climate justice. So please go over there and talk to them about the fine work that they're doing. By the way, there's a QR code in the corner here. The QR codes are for all these groups. If you want to just click a picture of that, you can go right to their websites and learn more. We also have Audubon Seattle or Audubon Washington. They're right over there in the corner. with the goal to protect birds in the places that need and survive and thrive through advocacy, community science, and by connecting people with the wonders of birds. There's 25 chapters and 35,000 members in Washington. So there's lots of opportunities to get involved, including outreach and education, volunteer docents and naturalists, community organizing around policies that reduce carbon emissions and the like. So please go over and talk to them as well. We have the Sunrise Coalition. This is Sunrise right there in the back. Sunrise is a youth-led movement fighting to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. So exactly what Asim was talking about. The simplest way to get involved with Sunrise Movement's Seattle Hub is to sign up. Back there, you can talk to those folks there as well. And of course, the sponsor of tonight's event, Cascadia Climate Action, they've got a table over here in the corner as well. As I've mentioned previously, Cascadia Climate Action, they do a lot of different activities around their website. CascadiaClimateAction.org is a one-stop shop to find out about what's going on in our local area. So please go over there and at least learn about a couple of things that you can do to help reduce your impact on climate and to fight for a better climate in the future. And then last but not least, I want to talk about Carbon Washington. Kyle Murphy was here with us, and they have a table back there as well. The goal of Carbon Washington is to move Washington State towards zero carbon emissions, which of course is a lofty goal, but one that we all need to fight to achieve. They develop policies to address climate change and also works to create the political will to enact those policies. So please go over and see them in the corner about things that you can do to get involved, especially with some of the bills that Kyle mentioned are currently working their way through the legislature. And last but not least, I'd like to make a plug for our next Climate Science on Tap. Our next event is Going to Extremes. Is it climate change or just bad weather? That's going to be April 23rd at 7 p.m. at the Beverage Place Pub. That's in West Seattle. So if you haven't been over to West Seattle in a while, head on over that way, learn a little bit more about extreme weather and its link to climate change. You join a great panel of folks over there on the 23rd. So please check that out too. And then last, I just want to give one more round of applause to our panelists, Asim, Kyle, and Jessen for all that they've done. I also want to thank the Cascadia Climate Action volunteers for being here tonight and helping out and setting up. So big round of applause for them too. And finally, make sure that you say thank you to the great folks here at Optimism. They allow us this space free of charge to hold these events. So say thank you for that opportunity and maybe have another beer. All right, y'all. You have a great night. Drive safe or commute safely, however you choose to do it.